is Marlene with Eerie News, and today is December 20th, 2023, Wednesday, December 18th, 2023, and our first story is out of Stranger Than Fiction, and it's titled, He Said He Killed Her for Love. There are persons who are never meant to hold positions of trust, and Hans B. Schmidt was one of them. Some are just untrustworthy, others are deadly. Hans B. Schmidt was born in the Bavarian town of Affensburg, one of 10 children. His mother Gertrude was Catholic and his father Heinrich was Protestant, but it was probably the beatings he received at the hands of his father that shaped the man he would become. He also witnessed domestic violence between his parents, brought about because Heinrich did not want her to practice her faith. Perhaps it was also a deep streak of mental illness that ran in his family. His father made a good living as a railroad official, but wasn't at home much. The demands of bringing up 10 children proved too much for his mother, who went into a depression and coped by attending church twice per day. The only one of her children who shared her devotion was Hans. The young Hans developed religious obsession, but sexual promiscuity with males and females as well. If this was not troubling enough, he was fascinated with drinking blood and dismemberment. His relatives described where he beheaded 2 geese kept by his parents and kept the heads in his pocket. Like a moth to the flame, he spent hours at the village slaughterhouse on a daily basis, where he watched animals being killed and chopped up while he ate pieces of fruit. The slaughterhouse seemed not to sate Hans for long. Chickens, rabbits, and squirrels were found horribly mutilated on the farm property, and the family knew it was not a wild animal. If it wasn't for the heinous act that landed him in prison later in life, none of his history would be known. But like many who prey on other human beings, their history is replete with warnings of the scourge they will eventually become to those around them. Sworn depositions from the Schmidt family filled in the blanks of his past. His older sister Elizabeth Schmidt Schadler described his fascination with blood at a young age, as well as sexual attraction to her. Hans' paternal great-grandfather was institutionalized due to alcoholism. A great-granduncle, Jacob Schmidt, was committed to an institution for his entire life and died there. Hans' maternal grandfather, Andreas Seppler, hung himself in 1849. In the aftermath of the suicide, his uncle Conrad shot himself. However, he had a history of cutting himself before the final act. Much of Hans' disturbing thoughts were found in his diaries. He never tired of producing hundreds of pages detailing all his lurid experiences. When he was 19 years old, he was admitted to the St. Augustine Seminary at Mainz in preparation for the priesthood. However, it seemed his religious training had not rubbed off sufficiently, because in 1904 he was arrested by Bavarian police for forging diplomas for failing students. Ironically, it was his father who hired a good attorney, which saved him from going to jail. The lawyer argued the charges should be dropped for reasons of mental defect. This was despite the fact the prosecutor of Mainz was intent on sending him to prison. Instead, he was sent to the cold water sanitarium at Jordanbad in Württemberg. He was there for a month and only took 1 bath. He was then sent to Engelsberg Monastery at Miltenberg to do penance. Soon the monks tired of dealing with him, since he refused to follow any instructions. They sent him back post-haste to the seminary at Mainz. In 1905, he followed the highly publicized murder case of Harry Thaw. His sympathies lay with the killer, and thought he was being persecuted. Perhaps Thaw was right in killing Stanford White, he surmised. It was apparent there was something wrong with Hans Schmidt, both morally and mentally, or perhaps, in present-day vernacular, he was a psychopath. He said that he was ordained by Bishop George Kirstein on December 23, 1904. However, conversations he had later in life with alienists, as psychiatrists of the day were called, seemed to reflect that an ordination with a vision he had of St. Elizabeth was the one that counted, at least in his mind. He described it this way, quote, "The bishop ordained me alone. I do not like to speak of it. The reordination took place the night before. St. Elizabeth, she ordained me herself. I was praying at my bedside when she appeared to me and said, 'I ordain you to the priesthood.' There was light during her appearance. I told no one. I thought it best to keep it to myself. They would make fun of me. They always make fun of me for these things. They always expect others to do as they do. God speaks to different people in different ways. He never explained why the bishop would ordain him alone at midnight in his room, but most probably it was because many in the seminary thought Hans was not priest material. He was assigned to the villages of Burgel and Seelingstadt, where he cut a wide swath of immoral acts with those who lived there. He molested altar boys, kept company with prostitutes, and had sexual liaisons with women. Schmidt gave sermons that were so strange that not only did the other priests complain about him, but parishioners as well. The bishop and Monsignor were in a quandary. They couldn't keep him there, but no other parish would accept him. Whether by his own decision or the diocese in Mainz, by 1909, Schmidt, then 28, was sent to the United States and assigned to St. John's Catholic Church in Louisville, Kentucky. Trouble soon brewed between him and the senior pastor, and he was sent to St. Boniface Church in New York City. Later rumors surfaced that Schmidt had been defrocked and banished in Germany. He had gone to America presenting his ordination papers to the church superiors, first in Louisville, then Trenton, New Jersey, and finally New York City, without mentioning that he was no longer a priest. 3 years passed, and it was in the rectory of the St. Boniface Church that he crossed paths with Anna Allmüller, the housekeeper. She had immigrated from the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1910 when she was 18 years old. Like his later disclosure about his ordination, he told alienists that he heard a voice, which he believed to be God, telling him to love Anna. She resisted the advances of a priest who was 10 years older than her, but eventually she became his mistress. In a pattern followed by his superiors at his prior post, who did not know how to handle the strange reverend, he was reassigned to St. Joseph's Church in Harlem. He continued in the secret relationship with Anna, and at the same time had a homosexual affair with Ernst Murray, with whom he was running a counterfeiting operation. Anna was fired from St. Boniface after it was suspected she was pregnant, and by none other than Father Schmidt. Perhaps to quiet Anna, who faced ostracism, not only by the church, but by the community, he performed a marriage between them, including filling out a marriage certificate. He told her he was leaving the church for her. Schmidt would go on to desecrate the high altar of St. Joseph Church by having sex with Anna on it. He said that God repeatedly told him to sacrifice her. Apparently, he told Anna about his impulses, and she called him crazy, but she was bound to him more than ever since she was pregnant. They went on to rent an apartment, even though he continued in his double life. On the night of September 2nd, 1913, he cut her throat with a 12-inch butcher knife while she slept, drank her blood, and raped her as she died under him. Later, he dismembered her body using a hacksaw and a knife. First was her head, then he cut her in half, wrapping each section in a newspaper dated August 31st. The lower part was in a pillowcase monogrammed with an A on it. He threw gray-green schist inside the pillowcases to weigh it down. He boarded the Fort Lee ferry 7 times and threw the pieces into the Hudson River. For Schmidt, it was business as usual. He returned to the church, performed Mass, and gave Holy Communion to the parishioners. It seemed the rocks didn't weigh the body down enough, and on September 5th, 2 children found the upper torso of a woman at Cliffside Park. 3 miles away in Weehawken, New Jersey, the rest of her came ashore, minus the head, though. Eventually, other grisly finds were made. The autopsy estimated the woman was in her 20s, was about 5 feet 4 inches tall, and weighed about 125 pounds. It revealed she had given premature birth just before she was killed. Eventually, the coroner would sew together 6 pieces of a body that had once been Anna Allmüller. Her head was never found. The first clue Hudson County Police found was a price tag attached to a pillowcase wrapped around the body part. It was traced to a factory in Newark, which sold only to George Sachs, a furniture dealer in Manhattan. The New York City Police Department took the case and assigned Detective Joseph Farrar to it. Farrar visited George Sachs at 2782 8th Avenue, but the furniture dealer couldn't remember how many pillowcases he sold. A check was made of his receipts, and there was a sale of a bedspring, mattress, pillow, and pillowcases on August 26, 1916. The buyer was A. Van Dyke, and the items were delivered to 68 Bradhurst Avenue to a 3rd-floor apartment. The building superintendent told them a married couple had rented the apartment 2 weeks before. He described the man as speaking with a thick German accent, and his name was H. Schmidt. The police watched the building, but no one came to the apartment. Eventually, the police forced the door and examined the interior. They found the floor was scrubbed, but there was dried blood splatters on the wall. Inside a trunk, they found the saw and the knife. There was also handkerchiefs with an embroidered A like the pillowcases. They found clothing with a label of A. Van Dyke sewn into the lining. There were letters in both German and English addressed to Hans Schmidt. Later, it would be revealed that it was Anna who had embroidered the A into the bedclothes that would eventually lead to her killer. Many of the letters originated from women in Germany. However, most of them were from Anna Almüller with an address of 428 East 70th Street. Inspector Farrow and Detectives Casassa and O'Connell went to the address and found that Anna had moved after being hired as a housekeeper at St. Boniface Church. This was their next stop, and the senior pastor, Father John Brown, said Anna had been his housekeeper, but had transferred to St. Joseph's Church. They asked him if he knew Hans Schmidt. Father Brown said he was a priest who had once served there, but had been transferred to St. Joseph's Church as well. The police finally found their man. It was after midnight when Father Daniel Quinn took them to Schmidt's room. The priest quickly admitted, "I killed her. I killed her because I loved her." He went on to describe how he murdered her and what he did with the body. Father Quinn listened in horror. Once arrested, the Archdiocese of New York suspended him. Considering he had confessed, his defense team argued that he was insane and presented his bisexuality and hearing voices to prove their claim. Dr. Smith Eli Jalife, a psychologist, testified that Schmidt should be spared the death penalty since he had up to 60 relatives who displayed signs of mental instability. Dr. Jalife said, on one occasion he had taken the head of a rooster and put it, while still bleeding, on the end of his penis, and had walked around strutting about with this decapitated head of this rooster on his penis until his father caught him and beat him. When he was 10 years old, Hans started a sexual relationship with a neighborhood boy named Fritz. They continued having sex for years. They both went to the slaughterhouse and would become sexually aroused with the sight of blood. During that period, Hans also began to have sexual relations with his older brother Carl. Other alienists who interviewed Schmidt before his first trial testified for the prosecution that despite Schmidt's story about hearing voices telling him to sacrifice Anna, he was completely sane. On September 16, 1913, Dr. Ernest Murray was arrested for his part in the counterfeiting scheme. The apartment where they ran the operation had been rented using the name of George Miller, which was an alias used by Muret. The pair had told renting agents they were medical students that were going to use the flat for experiments. Authorities found plates for $20 yellowbacks, which seemed to have been made by an expert engraver. They also found $10 false bills. Murray told police he was born in Chicago and received his dental certificate in 1911. He said he had studied abroad for 14 years and had been a student at the Berlin Dental College, but had not passed his examination and didn't receive a diploma. He returned to New York in 1903 and served as an assistant to other dentists before opening his own office 2 years before. Murray was convicted in October 1913 of counterfeiting charges and sent to the federal prison at Atlanta to serve a 7-year sentence. It turned out he was never a dentist, but he was not prosecuted for this. In December 1913, the trial ended in a hung jury of 10-2. Two of the jurors seemed to be swayed by the argument that Schmidt had killed Anna because he was insane. 2 weeks later, the second trial began, and the prosecution brought in a new witness. Her name was Bertha Zeck, a fellow German immigrant who said that in April 1913, before Schmidt supposedly heard the voices, she posed as Anna Almüller and purchased a $5,000 life insurance, naming Father Schmidt as the sole beneficiary. Bertha worked for Murray as a maid at his office. It came to light that Schmidt and his lover planned a series of murders and insurance frauds, and had blank death certificates ready to be falsified. On February 5, 1914, it took the jury only 3 hours of deliberation to find Schmidt guilty of first-degree murder. After being sentenced to death, he said, "I'm satisfied with the verdict. I would rather die today than tomorrow." He was sent to Sing Sing prison. While he was in the tombs awaiting execution, Schmidt declared that he was planning to do away with the hopelessly insane, the permanently crippled, and those suffering from incurable diseases by poison or by knife. As was expected, Schmidt's attorneys filed an appeal and stayed his execution for 1 year. In December 1914, Schmidt confessed to feigning insanity, but said Ernst Murray, his homosexual lover, had accidentally killed Anna during a botched abortion. His love for Murray had made him take the blame for the crime. The ploy didn't work, and Schmidt went to the electric chair on February 18, 1916. His last words were, "I want to say one word before I go. I beg forgiveness of all I have offended or scandalized, and I forgive all who have offended against me." Then before the switch was thrown, and he had the hood over his face, he said, "My last word is to say goodbye to my dear old mother." Newspapers have been avidly following the story. A reporter with the Albany Times wrote, "His last night on earth he spent proclaiming his innocence and declaring that he had made peace with God. The guards had expected a scene when the slayer was to be executed, but his action surprised them. He was the coolest man in the death chamber. He almost domineered those who insisted in putting him to death." Schmidt was interred by Father William Cashin in Sing Sing Cemetery, since his body couldn't be sent back to Germany because of World War I. The Schmidt family asked his burial location to be kept secret. Even though their crimes were never proven against him, he was a suspect in several cold cases. He kept company with a woman named Helen Green, who left to Chicago a month before Anna was murdered. Helen Green was never found in New York or Chicago. It's thought he did away with her. There was another woman Schmidt was seen with soon after his arrival in America that he said was his wife. She also disappeared. Schmidt's attorneys recalled a conversation with his client. He said, quote, "He admitted that he had taken a small boy to an apartment at 124 West 84th Street, but denied that it was his son. He said he couldn't tell who the boy was because he didn't want to drag his family in. As for the girl, Helen Green, for whom the police are looking for, Schmidt said that he had met her casually and described her as a girl of the streets." End quote. This coincided with a story told by another person, which led authorities to believe it wasn't only women he killed. The owner of the apartment building where he lived said that she saw him sometimes bring a 5-year-old boy to his room. He said the boy was his son, but one day he disappeared. When the landlady asked him the name of the boy, he said it was August Van Dyke. Police had found a letter from Helen Green, who wrote Schmidt that she could not live without him. It was believed she was in Chicago, but after her disappearance a month before, no trace of her could be found. She had met Schmidt in the winter of 1912. Once Schmidt's photograph was publicized, many recognized him as the man frequently seen along the Great White Way, which was how Broadway was known in those years, enjoying the nightlife. He represented himself as the Count and the son of noble persons. Schmidt was also a suspect in the murder of Alma Kellner, 9, whose body was found buried in the basement of St. John's Church in Louisville. On December 8, 1909, she left her home at 507 East Broadway in Louisville to attend Mass at St. John's Church. She was wearing a brown plaid dress with cream velvet trim and collar. Over this she wore a dark brown coat and a red hat. It was the feast of the Assumption of the Virgin Mary, and solemn Mass was planned. This was 6 blocks from her home. She failed to return, and by the afternoon her family notified police. The force scoured the city looking for her, and hospitals were contacted to see if a child fitting her description had come into their care. As the hours passed, no clue was found. Authorities theorized she might have been kidnapped since the family was well off. The weeks turned into months, and no ransom note was received by the family. On May 26, 1910, the custodian of St. Joseph's School found the basement was flooded almost 4 feet due to a broken pipe. 4 days later, a plumber found that a bad stench pervaded the basement once the water level had dropped to 1 foot. As he started to clear out the debris with a shovel, he struck something just under the water. From the light of a lantern, he saw a small foot and shoe sticking out from the rubbish. 10 minutes later, the police arrived, and soon confirmation was made that Alma Kellner had been found. Her body was wrapped in a carpet. When the coroner touched the carpet, flesh fell from the bone. The right foot was missing from below the knee, and both hands were gone. Most of what was left was skeletal. Her skull was fractured in several places, and pieces of the cranium had broken off. Some of the bones were charred. Father Schulman, the pastor at the church, did not know the cellar even existed until the problem arose with the broken pipe. The police theorized that whoever brought her there knew of the place beforehand, since its existence was not common knowledge. Inside a closet, police found a remnant of a carpet that matched the one she was wrapped in. This was the closet used by the janitor. They also found a blood-stained man's shirt inside. The school janitor, Joseph Wendling, had been questioned when the girl disappeared in December and walked off the job the following month. His wife, Lena Wendling, still lived on the school grounds in the janitor's apartment. She told police he had a history of leaving his job without any reason. Wendling had been hired at the church in November 1909, and he had keys to all the buildings on the property. Wendling went from state to state until a detective from Louisville caught up with him in California. This was 3 months after the discovery of Alma's body. He kept insisting he had not killed the little girl. By December, he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Alma's uncle requested that Wendling should be pardoned and deported to France, his country of origin, in 1935. He served 26 years in prison for the crime and claimed he was innocent until the day of his death. When Schmidt was asked about the Kellner girl, who was killed during the time he was posted to St. Louisville, he said he had never heard of her. This was strange since the crime had made the front page news and she was a student at the Catholic school he visited in 1909. Considering the child's body was found only a few feet away from the altar, the diocese cooperated with the authorities, so it would be difficult to believe he was not familiar with the girl. The notoriety of Schmidt's crimes in the United States led German police to trace evidence of a murdered girl in Schmidt's hometown of Affensburg back to him. The Germans never had a chance to question Schmidt before he was executed in the United States, and the case went cold. Farrow gave a chilling description of Schmidt for a New Zealand newspaper in 1913. Quote, "He has been characterized by some as an archdemon. I should prefer to designate him a monster, for most certainly he is the most monstrous creature that ever confronted me in my long connection with the police." End quote. There you go. Let me tell you something. That guy was giving off lots of signals that he was not that he was insane, that he was very, very dangerous. Now, this next story is out of New York Post, and it's titled, oh, let me see, what was it there? There we go. What was this? Vampire child with padlocked ankle dug up in 17th century cemetery, feared during life. Let's see. Sink your teeth into this discovery. Archaeologists have found the remains of a so-called vampire child dating to the 1600s in Pien, Poland cemetery. The skeletal scraps were estimated to be from a child aged between 5 to 7. The remains were discovered lying face down with a triangular padlock attached to one of its feet. Archaeologist Dariusz Polinsky from the University of Nicholas Copernicus gave some insight into his exploration and why the corpse was bonded to the lock. He noted that the item placed under the foot symbolizes the closing of a stage of life and is meant to protect against the return of the deceased, which was probably feared. Wow. Incredible. There we go. Let's keep going on this. The rituals of the time period reportedly state that when a person was buried face down, the dead would bite into the ground and not harm the living, according to Polinsky. 30 other interments were uncovered, and archaeologists believe that people who were feared not only during life but also after death were also entombed in the region. Pieces of green-stained jaw were also unearthed and may have originated from a copper coin put into the mouth of a dead child, one of 3 others found, researchers said. The remains of a pregnant woman were additionally found, including a fetus that was determined to be roughly 5 to 6 months old, according to college representative Magdalena Zagrodska. This is surprising because the bones of the children of this age are poorly mineralized, so they are usually not preserved, she explained. The area where the possibly blood-sucking kitty was acquired turns out to be the same 17th century graveyard where a vampire woman was discovered by Polinsky and his research crew in September 2022 with a sickle seemingly restraining her neck and a padlock on the big toe of her left foot. Well, let's see. Ways to protect against the return of the dead include cutting off the head or legs, placing the deceased face down to bite into the ground, burning them, and smashing them with a stone, Polinsky said. He further divulged that the sickle was not laid flat. Instead, it was put on her neck in such a way that if the deceased had tried to get up, most likely the head would have been cut off or injured. The padlocked toe symbolizes the closing of a stage and the impossibility of returning, according to the historian. So yeah, that was this is as far back as that belief in vampires goes, that it's, everybody thinks of Bram Stoker sometime during the 18th century, and at least the Polish people, they believed in that stuff. They took it seriously enough that look at all the trouble they took with the burials after the fact, even if it was a child. Even if it was a child. This other story is out of Stranger Than Fiction Stories and is titled, Is a Case Ever Cold Enough? From 1980 to 1991, several children were kidnapped and killed. Some cases were solved after many years, and some remain open and unsolved. The first child to disappear was Susie Bombardier, a 14-year-old honor student who was kidnapped, raped, and stabbed to death on June 22, 1980. 5 days after her disappearance, she was found floating in the San Joaquin River east of Antioch, California, by a fisherman. This was about 100 miles from where she lived. The girl was taken from her sister's home while babysitting, leading her family to believe she knew her abductor. The case languished and at one point was considered Antioch's oldest cold case. It wasn't until 2015 that DNA samples from the victim were sent to a lab in order to make a profile. In 2017, the police were notified of a hit, and it was identified as a match to Mitchell Lynn Bacon, a California native with an extensive criminal history. In 1973, he was arrested in Mountain View, California, and convicted of second-degree burglary, sodomy, and assault with intent to murder. He got 5 years to life. By the time 1980 rolled around, he was out on the street again, which is when he preyed on Susie. In 1981, he was arrested in Sacramento County and convicted of first-degree burglary, robbery, rape, and sodomy, and was sentenced to 24 years in prison. In 2002, he was out again and failed to register as a sex offender with Contra Costa County and sentenced to 4 years in prison. Even though he had been a suspect in the Bombardier case, it wasn't until March 2022 that he was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole through a DNA match. At the sentencing, prosecutors said that Bacon had admitted to cellmates he had raped and sliced prostitutes across the country when he was a truck driver. Bacon and Bombardier's sisters had dated in the past, which this is how he saw this girl. And a lot of them, that's how they become aware. And that's basically also why she knew him. 3 years later, this is after 3 years after the abduction of Bombardier, Antioch was rocked again by the kidnapping and murder of another girl. She was Angela Bouguet, who vanished on November 19, 1983 from Antioch. She was found a week later. She'd been strangled and sexually assaulted. People suspected Larry Christopher Graham, a commercial pilot who lived in the same apartment complex as her family and had a history of sexual offenses against children. Graham had once been a lover to Susan Bouguet, Angela's mother. A few weeks after Angela was killed, Graham asked Susan Bouguet to marry him, and she turned him down. It wasn't until 1996 that Graham was arrested for the crime. The case against him was built using DNA testing using semen taken from Angela's body. In 2003, after being found guilty, he was sentenced to death. In 2009, while on death row at San Quentin prison, he was found unresponsive and pronounced dead less than an hour later. It was suspected it was a suicide. He was 58 years old. Ironically, during the time Graham was on trial, his son Larry Christopher Graham Jr. was being tried for the murder of Anthony Frank Buccellato, 57, who he pushed off a speeding truck into Highway 4 traffic in 2001. Charged as an accomplice, he testified in his trial that he had beaten Buccellato and decided to take him to the hospital when he realized the man was dead, so he pushed him out of the truck instead. Graham claimed the incident that led up to the skirmish with Bucalato was not a botched robbery, but he was punishing him for making sexual advances at a teenage girl. The girl in question testified that it was indeed a robbery attempt. Graham Jr. was convicted of first-degree murder and robbery and sentenced in June 2003 to 26 years 8 months to life in prison. But returning to the 1980s, when the Bugay case was 5 years old and unsolved, another child went missing. On June 3, 1988, Amber Schwartz, 7, was taken a few miles from Antioch, California. Within days of the little girl's disappearance, a stranger named Timothy Binder introduced himself to the Schwartz family and said he was searching for the girl as well, but also told them they should be looking for a dead body. For years he played a mouse and cat game with the family and police, claiming he was trying to find the girl, but at the same time foretelling the disappearance of other children. On June 15, 1988, bloodhounds tracked Amber's scent to the grave of Angela Bugay. Police already knew that Tim Binder visited the cemetery to drink a beer while he leaned on Angela's tombstone. In 1989, Binder was detained by police in San Pablo, California, when he was seen sitting in a van talking to a group of kids. He was arrested on a misdemeanor charge of annoying and disturbing children after two 12-year-old girls complained that he kept offering them a ride. At his booking, they found a note in his wallet that read, quote, "I love you, Amber. You are my first, and I tried for you. Tried and cried and still ache in my heart. They will always try to pull me back, but I never will. They don't know about us. They never heard of us." End quote. In 2013, Amber Schwartz's case was reopened after it was closed in 2009 due to the confession of a murderer already serving prison time. His name was Curtis Dean Anderson. He confessed to a murder in 2007, a month before he died in prison from kidney and liver failure. However, police could not find any evidence to sustain this. Amber's mother did not believe his confession was truthful and that he just wanted to make a name for himself. He confessed on a brief handwritten statement that read, quote, "If there is no pursuit of the death penalty, I will freely admit my role in being responsible for the death of Amber Schwartz Garcia." End quote. He said he was driving to Arizona and took the girl as company. He told investigators he kept the girl sedated by giving her root beer schnapps and killed her at a motel room in the Tucson area before disposing of her body in the desert. In 2019, Anderson's son, Curtis Dean Anderson Jr., committed suicide. He was serving a 16-year voluntary manslaughter sentence for killing 31-year-old Vance Fisher in 2005. It seems that Amber's mother was no stranger to tragedy. Amber's father, Floyd Bernie Schwartz, a Panola police officer, was killed while pursuing a parolee in 1980. His wife was pregnant with Amber then. The killer was James Odell, who died in December 2020 while serving his sentence. He died from natural causes at the age of 71. Let me tell you something. Talk about, that's pretty bad. You're pregnant, your husband gets killed, and then you lose a daughter to a kidnap. That's pretty bad. In 1995, Timothy Binder was discounted as a suspect in the Bugay murder with the arrest of Graham. However, there were still 4 unsolved kidnappings. One of them was Michaela Joy Garrick, 9, who disappeared on November 20th, 1988, on a trip to the grocery store. Her body has never been found. In 2020, David Mish, who was convicted in 1990 of the 1989 stabbing murder of 36-year-old Margaret Ball, was charged with murdering Michaela due to his prints being found on her scooter. He is also suspected of killing 2 women in Fremont in 1986. Eventually, he will be charged with their murders. The women were best friends, Michelle Xavier, 18, and Jennifer Dewey, 20. In March 2023, Mish was ordered to stand trial for all 3 crimes. However, the judge said he believed that when it came to the death of Xavier and Dewey, Mish didn't act alone. His proceedings are ongoing. On December 27, 1991, Amanda Nikki Campbell, age 4, vanished close to her Fairfield, California home. She was riding her bike to a friend's house only 8 doors away from her home. Her bike was found, but the child was never seen again. In 1992, Tim Binder was named a prime suspect. As a former crematorium worker, He would visit the graves of young children, taunting the suffering parents, and would give neighborhood girls cash gifts, cards, and poems. He would ultimately be tied to 5 cases, yet police were never able to link him to any of them. He said he was just a good Samaritan and won a suit against the city for defamation of character and was awarded $90,000. Amanda's case is still cold. What happened with J.C. Dugard justifies the hopes that parents have when the bodies of their children are not found. J.C. Lee Dugard, 11, was taken on June 10, 1991, when she walked home from a school bus stop in Myers, California. In 2009, convicted sex offender Philip Garrido visited the campus of University of California, Berkeley, with 2 adolescent girls. Due to their suspicious behavior, police interviewed them. It turned out the girls were daughters he had with Dugard. Garrido and his wife Nancy were arrested in April 2011. They pled guilty to kidnapping and raping Dugard. They had kept J.C. prisoner for almost 20 years. Garrido was sentenced to 431 years and his wife Nancy to 36 years to life. In 2010, the state of California awarded the Dugard family $20 million. Since Garrido had been on parole for a 1976 rape when she was kidnapped, he had not been monitored as should be while the state was supervising him. In 2002, police were searching the home of Stephen Kisley, a defrocked priest in connection to the Schwartz case. However, there was nothing to connect him to the murder. They were also looking for evidence connected to several cases of kidnapped children. One of them was J.C. Dugard, who had yet to be freed from a horrible existence. The search warrant was also related to Tony Franco, 10, who was last seen walking along Fremont Way in Lemon Valley and reported as leaning over and talking with an unknown subject in a rusted out, possibly a Ford Pinto or even a Camaro car. He was on his way to school on May 9, 1983 when he vanished. 4 years later, 4 years after Tony Franco was taken, another girl disappeared. At 3 p.m. on Sunday, June 28, 1987, 11-year-old Jennifer Lee Martin purchased candy and a 6-pack of Coca-Cola at a 7-Eleven convenience store on Lemon Drive in Reno, Nevada. She walked out of the store headed toward her nearby home. She was last seen a short distance from where Tony was kidnapped. Authorities had good reason to suspect Stephen Kisley. He had already been charged with cases of molesting children in his Alameda County parish between 1969 and 1971. In 2004, he was sentenced to 6 years in prison for sexually assaulting a young girl a decade earlier at his vacation home. Kisley was released in 2009 and moved to Rossmore, California, the following year. He had previously served 3 years probation after pleading no contest in 1978 to misdemeanor charges that he tied up and molested 2 boys. He was later charged with 13 counts of child molestation linked to allegations from the 1970s, but they weren't brought to trial because of the statute of limitation. They dug up his yard but found nothing. In April 2022, Kisley was charged in a fatal crash that killed a man. Kisley, now 75, was driving under the influence when they struck a couple on a sidewalk in the retirement community of Rossmore. Unfortunately, these cases are only a small sample of kidnappings and murders that took place within a 10-year span. Some of them were resolved in some cases with good police work or DNA technology, but not all. It is obvious that in those years very dangerous pedophiles were on the streets, stalking prey, and who easier than a child. As of 2023, the cases of Amber Schwartz, Eileen Michaloff, Amanda Campbell, Tony Franco, and Jennifer Lee Martin are all cold cases. So yeah, even though the advances of DNA helps a lot, sometimes if there's no confession, if there's no connection, and even then, if some other families have even passed away, some of these older ones. Next story is out of New York Post. Headless vampire remains discovered in 1800 Polish mass gravesite. I'm telling you, the Poles took their vampire stuff seriously. A bone-chilling mass graveyard containing headless skeletons and anti-vampire items had been unearthed in near northern Poland amid road construction. Workers in the Kashubian village of Luzino stumbled upon the burial ground while widening Kosinia Street by an 18th century church. Poland's Poland's the first news reports. Many of the 450 bodies appeared to have been exhumed and reburied, with experts believing superstitious family members dug up their loved ones and decapitated them to end the vampire curse. Several of the deceased had a skull between their legs and a coin in their mouth, a sign of the anti-vampire rituals common in the 19th century. We discovered examples of belief in the dead returning from the grave, which could only be stopped by decapitation. Maciej Stromsky, who is leading the excavation, told. That's incredible. Let's see. It was believed that if a member of the deceased's family was dying shortly after the funeral, he or she could be a vampire, he added. Therefore, after burial, the grave was dug up and the deceased heads was cut off, which was then placed in the legs. Stromsky said that 20 to 30% of the recently discovered bodies had bricks next to their head, arms, and legs. A coin was placed in each mouth, with one dating back to 1846. The coin apparently sealed in the person's soul and gave them currency to travel to the afterlife. There you go. Let's see. We also discovered an example of a woman after decapitation, Stromsky continued. The skull of a child was laid on her bosom. First, it was reported the church was built at the beginning of the 18th century and expanded after 1945. At some point, its old graves were liquidated and large quantities of bones were deposited in ossuaries. Stromsky notes his team discovered loose bones in 3 ossuaries. A Luzino community page noted in March that construction was underway by the church, with renovations expected to last into September. Just last year, researchers in Pien, Poland, reported discovering the remains of a female vampire who had been buried with a sickle across her neck and a padlock on the big toe of her left foot to prevent return from the dead. And yes, and that was from the prior story. That's what I'm saying. These deviant burials, and it's interesting because they look at it as, like they said, if somebody died and then shortly thereafter other family members died, God knows for any reason, immediately it was thought that there was this dead family member had come to claim them. So, I mean, they took this stuff, they weren't taking any chances. How's that? Next story is from Stranger Than Fiction Stories and is titled The Lost Girls. In February 1998, human remains were unearthed near Bothell outside of Seattle. It appeared to be skeletal remains of 2 persons. The first set of bones was found by a transient who spotted a skull lying on top of straw that was scattered over a newly graded construction site. Before the month... We'll come back here. Everything went crazy here. Go back. No, go back. Here we go. Before the month was out, they were identified as the remains of Sammy Jo White, 11, and Carmen Joy Cubillas, 9, half-sisters who had gone missing in July of 1996. The Kings County medical examiner said the victims had been killed probably soon after they disappeared. The girls were living with their mother, Margaret Delaney, in the Crest Motel on Aurora Avenue North. The family was transient, never staying long in one place, at least not long enough for them to go to school. Sam White and Leonel Cubillas, fathers of the girls, had a hard time keeping track of their daughters, as their mother would move from one cheap motel to another. Besides the girls, there were 7 other siblings all living together at the motel. The places they were staying at were in unsafe neighborhoods. The last address was the Crest Motel in room 16. They had moved there the day before the girls vanished. They were last seen on Aurora Avenue, which was rife with drug dealing and prostitution. The girls had left the motel around 10:30 p.m. to beg for food at a Taco Time restaurant down the street and to bum cigarettes for their 16-year-old brother. A family friend said both girls were like little mommies left to raise their younger siblings. When Margaret Delaney returned to the motel, the girls were gone, and she waited 3 hours before calling police. The police believed the girls had run away, even though their mother denied this. She told police the girls didn't have money, but they knew how to panhandle. For 7 years, the case lingered as unsolved. Then in 2005, The case was being re-examined for connection to Joseph Duncan, a convicted sex offender and murderer. On July 2, 2005, Joseph Edward Duncan III was arrested at Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, at a Coeur d'Alene, Idaho diner after he was seen with kidnapped victim Shasta Grown, age 8. Duncan was later charged with killing Shasta's mother, brother, and her mother's boyfriend in their Idaho home on May 16, 2005. He was also accused of kidnapping Shasta and her brother Dylan 9 and sexually abusing them for 7 weeks before killing Dylan. Later, he provided the FBI with details about the murder of the two girls, but didn't give a confession. He also talked about another youngster he killed in Southern California in 1997. In 1978, Duncan raped a 9-year-old boy at gunpoint. He was sent to a juvenile facility where he told the therapist he'd raped 13 boys by the time he was arrested. The next year, he stole a car. In 1980, he stole guns from a neighbor, kidnapped the 14-year-old boy, and like the prior incident in 1978, raped him at gunpoint. He received a 20-year sentence but was paroled 14 years later. Within 2 years, he had violated his parole, but instead of sending him back to prison, he only spent a few days in jail for the violation. It was during this time that he killed Sammy Joe White, Carmen Cubillas, and Anthony Martinez, despite being supervised as part of his parole. He was returned to prison in 1997 when he was arrested in Missouri for violating his parole. In 2000, he was released for good behavior and headed to Fargo, North Dakota. However, in 2005, he was charged in the molestation of 2 boys at a playground in Minnesota. This occurred in 2004. His bail was set at $15,000 by a Becker County judge, and he posted bail with the help of a Fargo businessman he had met. Unsurprising, he skipped bail, and a federal arrest warrant was issued for unlawful flight to avoid prosecution. On May 16, 2005, the bodies of the Grown family were discovered in Idaho. 2 of the children, Dylan and Shasta, were missing. 7 weeks later, Shasta was recognized at a Denny's restaurant since her picture had been distributed by law enforcement. Police arrived and she was reunited with her biological father. Later, they found the remains of her brother outside a remote cabin in Lolo National Forest in Montana. In October 2006, Duncan pled guilty to first-degree murder and kidnapping of 3 persons at the Grown home. He was sentenced to death 3 times over. 4 months later, he pled guilty to the murder and torture of Anthony Martinez, 10, that was taken in 1997. In March 2021, Joseph Edward Duncan, 58, died at a hospital in Terre Haute, Indiana, from brain cancer while awaiting execution and serving multiple life sentences in federal prison. Even though the case of Sammy Joe and Carmen is considered solved, it was only done so because Duncan supposedly admitted to the murder. But he was never charged with the crime. The information about the murders came from Shasta Grown, who Duncan kidnapped. And according to FBI agents, he provided details of the crime that were not known to the public. He described where he beat both girls to death with a crowbar. In one of the videos shown to the jury during Duncan's trial, while he's torturing Dylan Grown, he screams, "The devil's in here, boy, the devil himself. The devil likes to watch children suffer and cry." It's horrible, because every time they let this guy walk on parole, he killed somebody. He killed or molested people. I'm sorry, but there's some people that parole is a bad idea. Okay, the next story is out of the Wall Street Journal. I think this is very cute. And it's titled, "Flaco, the famous New York City owl, has become a peeping Tom." New York. One recent morning, Riley Richardson woke up to being watched. She jumped out of bed, went to the window of her Manhattan apartment, and fell to the floor when she saw the peeper. "It absolutely scared the you-know-what out of me," she recalls, about the 2-foot-tall owl staring back at her. "It's New York City. It's the last thing you expect to see." Richardson, 31, and an actor, didn't know it then, but her feathered visitor was Flaco, an orange-eyed Eurasian eagle owl who became a New York celebrity after he escaped a zoo in February and turned leafy Central Park into his home. He's drawn binocular-toting crowds who couldn't help but root for a creature like them trying to make it in the big city. Over time, though, Flaco's behavior has shifted. He's become a true nosy New Yorker, a bit of a hoot, and a real owl about town. Flaco is a gawker, flying out of Central Park and around Manhattan, sometimes standing outside windows with his beak to the glass and his large, round eyes peering inside. I audibly gasped, says Matt Sweeney, a digital marketer who was at his desk at home in the Upper West Side of Manhattan recently when Flaco graced his third floor window. Like strangers drawn to one another in a subway encounter, man and bird gazed into each other's eyes for a few seconds. It was pretty mesmerizing, says Sweeney 24. Then Flaco flew away. Flaco may have taken to peeping behavior because he sees humans as potential mates, says Kara Blom, the executive director at the International Owl Center. Another possibility, he's just curious. It's hard to know what he's thinking, she says. Flaco isn't afraid of humans, Blom says, having been raised by them. He was born in 2010 at a North Carolina bird sanctuary thousands of miles away from the wooded regions of Europe and Asia where other Eurasian eagle owls live in the wild. He made his debut at the Central Park Zoo in the first year of his life. Flaco fled on February 2nd, and his case has become a whodunit. The zoo said it noticed him missing at 8:30 p.m. and found the stainless steel mesh of his exhibit cut. Police said there haven't been any arrests, and the zoo didn't respond to requests for comment. Flaco, who has a 6-foot-long wingspan when he takes flight, spent his first night of freedom on Fifth Avenue standing outside a Citibank. News crew and pedestrians flocked to him. Well, that was a hoot, police said on X, the former Twitter. We tried to help this little wise guy, but he had enough of his growing audience and flew away. Flaco eventually ventured into Central Park, where zoo officials spent more than 2 weeks trying to entice him with owl sounds and food. Some fretted Flaco wouldn't fend for himself after a life fed by humans, but soon he was seen hunting and swallowing rats. The zoo gave up on trying to capture him. He stayed within Central Park for nearly 9 months, and bird lovers kept abreast of Flaco movements via Manhattan Bird Alert, the X account run by investor David Barrett, who posts the best kind of tweets whereabouts of birds in the city. Owls have made Central Park their home before, and then died or disappeared, but none was a zoo escapee like Flaco, who has generated headlines worldwide. He's become a symbol of freedom, says Barrett, of overcoming difficulties. Stella Hamilton, a retired registered nurse who lives near Central Park, visited Flaco daily since his escape. It's how I got my step-ins, she said. She grew worried when she couldn't find him for more than a week in early November. Hamilton was running errands when she got an alert that Flaco was spotted in the East Village, about 6 miles south of Central Park. She jumped into a cab, making it in time to see Flaco fly from a tree bench to a building roof, glaring back at the crowd. It felt like there was meaning to his gaze, Hamilton recalls. You again? She imagines he was thinking, how did you find me? 2 days later, about a mile south in the Lower East Side, psychologist Robin Hertz Paparn, 38, was on her couch reading and cuddling with her cat Lucy Goose when she heard what sounded like a crash landing. Lucy Goose jumped up to investigate. So did Hertz Paparn, who looked out the window to see an owl on an air conditioner more than a dozen flights up. He was just staring off at the skyline, she says, recalling how Flaco looked at her before turning his head again. I think he was just taking in the city life. Manhattan is treacherous for Flaco, says Blom of the International Owl Center. He could eat a poisoned rat or get hit by a car, while she says Flaco could live 30 more years in the zoo. But he does have his freedom, she says. It's kind of a blessing and a curse. Richardson, the actor, says she awoke to find Flaco watching her for 3 mornings in a row, spending more time outside her window each time. She posted videos of him on social media, and Flaco fans crowdsourced owl wisdom. Was Flaco ill? Could Richardson investigate? Could they come over and visit him? That one was a no. Through a window, Richardson examined the color droppings Flaco left on the air conditioner and eyed his vomit. Pellets made of rat bones, rat fur, and other things he can't digest. He seemed fine. Eventually, he moved along. I hope he comes back, Richardson says. It was really fun 3 days. Since his flight downtown, Flaco has moved closer to the park, showing up on top of water towers and within building courtyards. Nan Knighton, a playwright and lyricist who lives across from Central Park on the east side of Manhattan, was on the phone when she saw Flaco outside her 13th floor kitchen window. I hung up and walked a little forward to make sure I wasn't hallucinating, she says. He stuck around for 3 hours. I talked to him, says Knighton, recalling telling Flaco he's beautiful and gorgeous and that she couldn't believe she was speaking to an owl. When she walked into another room, Flaco's head swiveled to follow her. Flaco stayed quiet until Knighton got within 6 inches of his face. He just let out this little tiny hiss, she says. It was kind of like, okay, I like you, but I don't want to be beak to beak. She turned her back to the owl to write something. When she looked back, Flaco was gone. That's a nice story. Okay, so there you go. A little bit of everything over here in Eerie News. So till next time.